Yeah.
Okay. So now having dealt with the theoreticals behind the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, I'm sure we'll come back to them anyway. We're just going to work our way through the essay pack onto the different ideas. So the first idea was which was the biggest challenge facing the colonies after independence. So there's a lot of problems they were dealing with. First of all, I'd like to say I think a lot of the problems aren't new. And that's fundamentally important, I think, to say that I think these were basically the same, more or less the same problems, with the exception, I know, even with national debt, that the British were facing at the end of the 7 Years' War. Basically, it's another war on the continent. Problems are still there. There are some additions to it. So I'd say you've got
I
the
think the British had obviously the British had a system though, whereas the Americans have a kind of ad hoc, have all these state legislatures, but the way to manage the national debt is
yeah,
tricky, right?
yeah. They
Tricky,
couldn't. I
tricky.
mean, that's the problem. They couldn't deal. The Articles of Confederation wasn't able to deal with most of these problems. But then again, I would argue I don't think the British were able to deal with the problems they inherited in 1763 either, hence why they ended up with America gaining independence. I think they weren't able to deal with it in a way that solved the problems. So I would
Can
say,
I can I can
yeah,
I just put forward a very obvious argument?
yeah, go on.
Well, wouldn't the most obvious factor be the first one, the divisions in the colonies? Because obviously, we can, with hindsight, in fact, it ended up being the division between the North and the South
Yeah,
that that spiraled into a civil war in the 1860s.
yeah.
Um,
Do you want me to set it up, and then you can lead which one you're going to argue
okay,
and
yeah,
why?
go that way,
Yeah,
sure.
because if some of the students have got like a bit of a background where they don't have it clear. So, and I'll
Yeah,
just run through the historical background to it, and then you lead off of where you think the most important is, and we can debate between these three. So
fine.
divisions in colonies. You had a lot of divisions in the colonies, as you said. Like North and South was quite key. Um, the North, but they were divided socially, or religiously, economically, in so many different ways. Um, and feel free to add anything I'm missing as well on any of these. Obviously, the North was South's economy was plantation based, growing of cash crops to sell abroad. They benefited from the mercantilist system that Britain had in place because they could trade goods back and forth with Britain, and they had a guaranteed market for them. Whereas the North was reliant mostly on fishing and trade, shipbuilding, rum, and other stuff that was
Industry.
again tied into the mercantilist system. But they were straining at this system at that point because they wanted to start manufacturing, and under the Navigation Acts and under the mercantilistic system, they were not allowed to manufacture. And this manifests as the nature of what they were growing changed the system as well. Obviously, because it's a plantation economy, slavery was really important in the South. I mean, slavery existed all the way through the colonies at this point. None of them had really given independent, like there were only a few of them had started to ban slavery at this point. And even in the North, even in New York was a slave state at independence. But slavery was a minor institution in the North, mostly based around like household slaves. Whereas the plantation economy in the South was fundamentally based on slavery. Without slavery, the economic system would have collapsed. So that creates another divide that comes in from that North-South divide. The third one is like the North was more representative democratically. They'd gone through the Great Awakening. They had a more vigorous Protestantism. It was more individual rights, whereas the South was still much more an aristocratic based economy that was running separately to that. Although still in both the North and the South, it was mostly rural, agrarian, farmer communities. These divides were still important. Anything you
Can
want
I
to add?
add another division?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think it's important that very quickly after Washington's presidency, two really big factions kind of emerged. In fact, they were there during Washington's presidency, right? And that faction was the difference between Hamilton's vision of a sort of very strong federal
Yeah,
united government and the Jeffersonian vision of the yeoman farmer, kind of agrarian America.
yeah,
And the division, it doesn't just reflect reality because obviously, there were people were living in very different situations throughout the country. But I think it's also a difference in aspiration. So it's actually values,
mm-hmm.
if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
So there's two parties, effectively two parties from the very beginning, with
Well,
two quite different visions of what America should be.
although
I think that's
they're not
yeah,
existing as parties yet, though, because obviously this is an
not
independence.
yet.
Yeah, but they're there. I see what you. Yeah, these
They're,
groups
they're,
are there. Yeah, and then
yeah,
Hamilton and
it's
Jefferson.
latent.
Yeah, Hamilton
Hmm.
and Jefferson take over these after the Constitution is formed. But do you want to go into this debate? What is the difference in the aspiration for you?
I think it's well, to put it very simply, I think Hamilton wanted he wanted a central bank. He wanted a fairly centralized system, um, and with a focus on industry. A bit, and his model was England. Hamilton admired England
Yeah.
enormously. Um, whereas Jefferson um, wanted a kind of more decentralized sort of republic of virtuous farmer yeomen.
Mhm.
So not urban, not industrial, but more farming. And all of the value, and that basic difference of situation leads to quite different pictures of the world. True, right? So
Yeah, I think that really manifests itself in the difference between the urban and rural areas as well. So like
yeah, right,
divided from the
right.
urban colonists. Again, if you look at this, like what would become the Hamiltonian faction is if you look down here, so you've got the loyalists are divided from the patriots. You've still got at the end of the war a large proportion of loyalists, most of whom leave to go off to Canada or Bahamas or off to various other colonies. They don't do very successfully and quite resent actually leaving after a while what they fought for. Divided families split people up, like a Brexit of,
Yeah.
of early times. So that loyalist patriot divide is there, but I don't think that survives very long after independence because I think most of the
The
loyalists,
loyalists go, don't they?
yeah, the loyalists
Well,
mostly leave. So and that kind of eliminates that divide. But
well,
the
they
other
take
ones are
them.
still there. And the Native Americans and white settlers, this divide in the West, especially where the white settlers now think the British government is gone. We want to expand westward, and we'll get to that with westward expansion. They're going to take these Native American lands, and the white settlers still, especially in the frontier zones, want to run there. And there's a good theory in the book I was just reading saying that basically the American government were not keen on letting them expand, but realized that they can't control them. And if they didn't let them go, they were flirting at some point. At this period, there was a lot of settlers in the West who were flirting with joining Spain or joining Britain, especially Spain, because they thought the Spanish would allow them to have access to the Mississippi River, wouldn't have any problems. So again, but that divide in the Native Americans saw the white settlers as a huge threat to their land in that period, and that was a problem. And then you've got the wealthy and middle class. So the difference between, as you said, those elites who favored a kind of monarchical, stable system, the Hamiltonian push in the end of designing along the lines of a new Riga. The Hamiltonian faction was afraid of popular democracy. They thought that would just lead to the tyranny of the uneducated. Whereas Jefferson kind of believed in perpetual revolution. The revolution has to keep blooding itself to develop and to continue progressing. And that also leads to the urban colonists divided from the back country. So, of course, the urban colonists are mercantilists in general, traders, want to get back to trading with Britain, have a transatlantic kind of view of the world, whereas the back country would be those Jeffersonian farmers who were interested in westward expansion, farming, agrarian land. And there was a conflict as well because like a lot of the urban elite were buying up the land in the West and then selling it at a profit to the poorer farmers and then kind of holding them in debt. So there was kind of this idea between like an elite landowning class versus kind of like a yeoman farmer class. And I think you're right to say that they became those two factions of the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian divide. So you could see like Hamilton ended up being in the divide with the urban, wealthy, mercantilist, northern, like creditor, pro-Britain class. And the Jeffersonian side was pretty much locked into rural, backcountry, southern, pro-slavery, plantation, small landowner, like debtor and pro-French side. And they literally split on absolutely everything. This country was incredibly divided, but I don't think any of those divides were new. I just think that it didn't matter when they were individual states because they didn't have to balance them against each other.
And I think that the big argument in order just to have a federal government in the first place.
Yeah.
I think that temporarily united some very different interests. Obviously, Madison and Hamilton worked together, right? When
Yes.
they wrote
Yes. Because I still think they all realized there needed to
these
be.
pamphlets in favor of the Constitution against the anti-federalists. So
Yeah,
sorry.
I think they realized that there needed to be a stronger federal government. The disagreement was just about what form that federal government was going to take, and that's where we get to, when we get to the forming of the Constitution, we get to the compromises they made on that. But do you think any of these divisions are new? I think they were there all the way through. Maybe they were exaggerated by the War of Independence, but I don't think any of them were new.
I think they were latent, but I don't think the interests become some of these interests in particular, like different divide between the North and the South. I don't think if there hadn't been a constitution, if it had remained some kind of loose confederation of states, well, there's not really an argument, is there? It's only once you have a united federal government where these differences really become acute, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And right. And I think the differences in particular become acute once you start to expand. So
Yes.
this gets into Northwest Ordinance and all of this stuff where, the big question, and of course this became, as a matter of fact, incredibly divisive in American government in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century was, if we get a new state, then will it be slave or will it be free?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. That's a problem that you can only have once you have the Constitution.
Yeah.
So I think, to put the point briefly, I think that, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, they get together, they make a very convincing case for a constitution, which wasn't obvious. No one even thought they wanted one. It wasn't even. We'll talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have it, once it is established, then all of these interests diverge. All of these latent interests, I should say, become bigger factors, I think, politically.
Yes. Because each colony was for themselves, and when they have to create the unified one, that's when they realize. I think maybe they didn't realize there was such a difference between. I don't think they cared, to be absolutely honest. I don't think they cared about the other colonies until they had to form together. So it's
and many of these problems don't exist until you have a federal government, right?
Yeah,
I
think they exist
to some extent.
The divide between North and South definitely doesn't exist.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. Obviously, westward expansion is a problem that was always there.
Urban versus the rural, I think, is that's a problem inside colonies, as well. So I think they all have these little mini conflicts between them. So I think some of these are latently in there, but I think there's nothing new here. It's just they're coming in the same way that, all the problems that came up between Britain and America came out of the end of the 7 Years' War, suddenly revealing all these divides when the French were gone. I now think exactly the same thing is happening. The divides between the colonies themselves is revealed once the British are gone after the War of Independence.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's the first battle, isn't it, against the British? Once the British are defeated, then the battle is: are we going to have a federal? We're going to have a federal government or not?
Yeah. Yeah.
Once that battle is won, then you have a whole lot of other battles. You have the different visions of the American government and different interests.
Yeah, which we're going to get into.
Should we ally ourselves with France or Britain, for example?
Yeah. And then further down the road, I think the Americans are just brilliant at kicking the can down the road. But all of these things lead to the Civil War, and we'll deal with the 19th century, of course, at some point, probably after the 20th century ones. We'll come back and deal with that. Other problems: national debt. So obviously, the national government borrowed money from abroad, but the states didn't want to pay it because some states owed money, some didn't, and they didn't want to form this national government. So it was problematic for them. I think, again, this is similar to the British problem at the end of the 7 Years' War. They borrowed too much money. They didn't have any money to pay for it. They were going to need to raise taxes. Only under the Articles of Confederation, they don't have the right to tax. So there's no federal taxation system. It's designed upon voluntary contributions of the states, of which, of course, they voluntarily contributed during the war because they had an enemy they had to defeat. But they didn't really. Once peacetime had come, there was no incentive for some states to pay back the debts of other states.
And correct me if I'm wrong, James, but I think that the problem the national debt in some ways dovetails with the difference between the wealthy class and the, say, middle or lower
Yeah,
classes,
yeah,
right? Because you have a very, very distinct difference of interests between debtors and creditors,
yeah,
right? One wants inflation, one doesn't.
yeah,
One wants debt forgiveness,
yeah,
one doesn't.
yeah, yeah. So this again, it adds to those divisions. So it's like an exacerbator to the divisions that are already there. Because of course, farmers owe debts to merchants. Merchants had lent the money. Farmers had gone off to fight in the militia. Obviously, they can't work on their farms. They then made no profit, and obviously, a lot of the farm products was confiscated, especially in the theaters of war during the war.
Yeah.
And
So if you've borrowed a lot of money, if
yeah,
you're in debt, then you actually want paper money. You want money to
yeah,
be printed out. You want inflation to go
yeah,
up, right? Because
yeah,
the same amount that you borrowed
yeah,
now is actually worth something different. But you can,
yeah,
you borrow $100
yeah,
in 1 year, 5 years later, it's really, you've got inflation.
yeah. So it's really
Um,
$10 you borrow. Yeah,
it's really $10. Then that's great.
yeah. But you can understand why the merchants were not too keen on this and only wanted to trade with the British because the British had hard currency. The Americans had no hard currency either. They couldn't mint anything. And of course, state governments were printing money. They were printing money in there. And then it was a fight. But of course, if you're looking at state governments elected on purely popular democracy, there's going to be more debtors than creditors. So a purely
Exactly.
democratic government would default on its debt.
That's right. So that's right, because there's a lot more people who are in debt. So that's why the wealthy elite class actually, I think, you know, they're a minority.
Yeah.
They're a
And
minority
they're
in terms
worried.
of
And
numbers.
then and they're worried about getting their money back. And of course, then this comes to battles where when they can't pay, even then they can't pay. If they haven't got the paper currency, there's no actual currency to pay with because there's no hard currency. The only hard currency is coming from abroad. And the
Yeah,
farmers aren't
and
getting hold of that.
and
The only people getting
and
hard
this
foreign
problem.
currency
Sorry.
merchants.
Yeah, that's right. And this problem links very nicely with Shays' rebellion. This is
Yeah.
exactly the problem.
Yeah. Yep. And we'll get onto that when
Shays'
we deal
rebellion.
with dealing with the
Yeah,
problems like the side pot. But yeah, these are obviously the catalysts for Shays' rebellion. Creditors wanted a stable currency, debtors wanted to print money. So again, you've got fights, and that's again between the urban and the backcountry because the majority of the debtors were farmers, rural, backcountry, agricultural, and the majority of the creditors were urban, city center, everything. Which is why you can see with Hamilton's interest in creating a national bank is because the national bank and the U.S. Mint create stability for urban merchants, which is part of his, his group in the country. Create stability in general, but you can see that all of these moves to create an America is what kind of America are you going to create? And you can see why, again, Jefferson was against these kind of movements because he really wasn't in favor or was more in favor of the rural farmers. He saw them as the real true Americans and the
yeah,
spirit of America coming from the farmers. Whereas Hamilton saw the spirit of America as a mercantilist global trading nation. And
yeah,
you can still, in a way, see these divides in modern America today
yeah. I think so.
between
I think
these.
it's a difference between the kind of East Coast and the Midwest,
Yeah,
isn't it? To some
yeah.
degree.
But it's also interesting how the major parties in America flip sides on this. You know, I mean, which
Yeah,
side is which? They're very fluid, the American major parties. I mean,
yeah,
the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln and Trump, and the Democratic Party is the party of Andrew Johnson and Barack Obama. I mean, there's a real big movements over that 150-year period.
yeah. Just quick historical trivia, James.
Yeah,
So a national bank was set up. Is that
yeah,
correct?
yeah.
Now,
After we'll get to that after the Constitution. So not
after the Constitution,
yeah.
was it true the bank was destroyed by Andrew Jackson?
Andrew Jackson, did he
Am
destroy
I
it?
getting am I getting that right?
Don't know.
President Andrew Jackson. Okay.
It would be
Well,
very much an Andrew Jackson move.
I'll have to look this up again. I shouldn't
I don't know if he
give you
destroyed it.
historical trivia.
He distrusted it, but doesn't say he destroyed it. So I think he was against it.
Yeah.
I think he decided against doing it in the end, but he was thinking about it. So he was thinking about destroying it because again, well, it makes sense because Andrew Jackson is there to he's the what if you take Jeffersonian populism to an extreme, you get Andrew Jackson. And if people want, like, Trump is basically a Jacksonian Democrat.
Right. Right.
Trump is the heir to that populist movement as well. But him and Bernie Sanders, weirdly enough, probably both of them Jacksonian Democrats. They have more in common with each other than they do with other people in their parties, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
okay.
then, yeah. And then, so westward expansion is the last one. So, of course, westward expansion. And the book I was just reading recently just said westward expansion is the biggest key factor of all of them, because most of the divides were exact, because it pulled all the other divides open. So increased conflict with Native Americans, obviously, because Native Americans had all the land to the west. Increased conflict with Spain over the Mississippi River, Louisiana, New Orleans, access to the ports, potential conflict with Britain over Canada, so the Northwest Territories, the lakes, the forts up there. They didn't want the white settlers to expand west, which is exactly the same as with the Proclamation Act. And in order to do that, they needed a strong army to enforce it. But they didn't have one because the Articles of Confederation didn't have an army, and they would need money to pay for one, which is exactly the same problems as at the end of the 7 Years' War. And I think it's exactly the same in terms of them not wanting to go. The only difference was Jefferson recognized that they had to let these settlers go. And he was like, the future's going to be them. He goes, either we get isolated in small groups or we let them run it. Because he goes, they're going to do it anyway. And there's nothing we can do to stop them. So they were just like, you can either resist them or just ride the wave. And I think they decided they would just ride the wave of westward expansion. And of course, as you said earlier, then they would have to say, what would happen when new states joined the Union? Would they be slave? Would they be slave owning? Would they be no? I believe when the Constitution is signed, and we'll get to that when we get to the Constitution, that there was 9 slave states to 6 non-slave states, effectively 6. So anyway, the slave states slightly outnumbered them, which is probably why slavery survived. But afterwards, very quickly, it got to an equilibrium of equal numbers. And then every time a new slave state joined, a new non-slave state had to join. But that's more in the 19th century ones. But again, it was balancing it. But this westward expansion would really exacerbate that divide between the North and the South, because at the formation, it was pretty evens between the North and the South in terms of votes and size. And then it was like, is it going to tip the factor? The South was worried that a new slave state would a new non-slave state would lead to the abolition of slavery. And the North was worried that more slave states joining would lead to Southern domination and what they considered a backward economic model of slave ownership and plantation economy, as opposed to like individual mercantilism and like merchant entrepreneurialism.
Indeed.
Yeah. So of these 3, which one do you think is the most important? Which was the biggest challenge?
Okay, cool. All right. So I think that can I start with the least important?
Yeah, go on.
I think the national debt is a big problem.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a very important reason, a very important motivation for arguing in favor of the Constitution.
Yeah.
Of the federal government. But in terms of the challenges facing the colonies after independence, I think in the long term, you could make a case, it could either be divisions in colonies or westward expansion, depending on how you argue it.
Yeah. Do you want to make your case?
I think practically the big divide, the biggest problem, the tension in American politics, again, this is from the benefit of hindsight, so maybe it's a little unfair.
Yeah.
But it's whether new states being added to the Union are slave or free.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm inclined to suggest that that's actually really a problem in the divisions in the colonies.
Yeah.
That actually it's really the divide between the North and South that's the critical issue. Strange because it doesn't seem critical at the time. There's a different set of debates going on. It's not exactly between the North and the South. But afterwards, I think that ends up being, and I think it actually ends up being the biggest challenge.
Yeah. I would say the divisions in the colonies are latent. They're under the surface. So they're starting to come out now, and they will be the biggest problems in the long run for sure. And especially, I think, after the Constitution. I would say immediately dealing with the national debt and westward expansion was the biggest problem, because the 3 things they go for with the Constitution because the Articles of Federation is 13 states, 1 vote per state with a veto power of any one state. Now, that's not going to function anywhere because there's no way with all the divisions in this country, rich versus poor, small state versus big state, north versus south, rural versus urban, Native Americans versus white settlers, loyalists versus patriots, slavery versus anti-slavery. There is no way in hell anything is going to have unanimous decision making between those 13 colonies, anything that needs to be done. So I think they're like, yeah, because they need to be able to raise
Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Did you see that Rhode Island kept stalling things?
Yes. It doesn't surprise me. It's a weird little place. And they were planning on invading it.
Love Rhode Island.
They were just like, we're gonna crush you. Like, if you don't start paying, we're just gonna
That's right. Can I just add an aside, just a quick digression. Do you know that Poland at a certain period, I think it was in the 18th century, had a constitution where they needed unanimous agreement in their legislature to pass a law.
Yeah.
And it meant that there were a lot of assassinations in the Polish parliament.
Because they had to take them out. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah. This is the unintended consequences. I mean, I don't know whether it's Massachusetts or Connecticut that was planning to invade Rhode Island, but they were just like, they were just going to crush you because you're the smallest colony. It's annoying. I think this is one of the reasons why, again, those small states wanted some power in the Constitution. But just goes to show
but that's a huge issue, isn't it? Because a bigger state would naturally want more influence.
Yeah.
But if you're a smaller state, you want equal representation, don't you?
Yeah.
So that's one of the big challenges.
Yeah, and that's one of the ones when we get to the Constitution, we'll talk about how they fixed what they did with that.
We'll get to that.
So then I was thinking, those divisions are, well, the Articles of Confederation set up was they can't do anything because in order to deal with westward expansion, they need an army and to deal with problems of debt. In order to deal with national debt, they need a national bank. So and they need to negotiate foreign treaties. Yeah. And these are the three powers the president is given in the original Constitution because they're the only things they want to give them. But these things, I think, are fundamentally issues. Westward expansion is going to be the one that leads to the Civil War. But I think it's a combination of westward expansion with the division between North and South.
So it depends on how you frame it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But can I ask, James, because there's an ambiguity in the question, though, because it says which was the biggest challenge facing the colonies after independence? Yeah. But after independence means up to today.
I think it means, I think it means literally.
Do you know what I mean? So how would you narrow it down?
I think they mean literally after independence, like as in at the end of the war.
Literally.
I think the end of the war, the Articles of Confederation, bit before the Constitution. I mean, it links.
Okay, before the Constitution. It doesn't say that.
No, but I think that is what it's leaning towards because I think otherwise it would name dates down. But I think it's just literally like what is the biggest challenge facing them once they've become their own country.
Because in that case,
these things.
In that case, you could make a very good case. Sorry.
For which one?
Well, in that case, you could make a very good case for the national debt.
Yeah, go on.
I think that was a massive problem immediately facing the colonies after independence. It depends if you're taking a short-term or a long-term view.
Yeah, so I think this one is a short-term. Yeah, you can argue the case. You can argue long-term, short-term. This is what they have that ability to do that, so that make the case depending where you go. So if you want to go short-term, you'd say national debt. Why?
Yeah, I think so. I think that. I mean, Shays' rebellion is an indication that we're actually violent rebellions. The cause of this was debt.
Yeah.
The kind of tangle of how to deal with all of the inflation with state legislatures producing their own currencies is massive at the time. I think that's the big one.
Yeah.
I think westward expansion has always been an issue and will continue to be an issue, but I don't think it's the biggest challenge exactly at this point. I think it's a problem, but
I think
it's not critical. I think that the national debt is really the critical one. And I think that the divisions in the colonies are latent and will become more important in the long term.
Yeah.
So if you want to take a long term, I'd say probably divisions in colonies, but the short term, no. So I'm actually completely doing a 180 here.
Yeah.
James.
That's all right.
In the short term, I think national debt.
Yeah, because if you basically define the question how you want to do it. I would agree. I would say westward expansion also is an immediate problem, but it's something that maybe isn't as obvious. So it depends on whether you think what's the biggest challenge that they're aware of, or what's the biggest challenge that's actually they're facing on the sideboard. the divisions in the colonies, obviously, we know where it goes, and we know it leads to the Civil War. So fundamentally, the divisions are. And in all honesty, I think those divisions are still there. I think North v
That's
South,
right.
West Coast v rural urban is there immediately. I mean, what's the percentage vote for Democrats? Democrats own every urban area, and Republicans own every rural area. The difference in
Yeah.
when people go, there are
Yeah.
Republican states and Democratic states. There aren't. There are Democratic
Yeah.
cities, Republican rural areas. It's just some states have more cities than others, and that's it. You know what I mean? Even Texas is 60-40 Republican, and
Yeah, absolutely. I think
California is 60-40
if you took the
Democrat.
most if you took the most long-term view, like up to
Yeah,
2024, I think it
yeah,
would be urban and rural.
yeah, yeah. North and South manifest, I would say,
I
in
don't think it's north and south exactly. I
wealthy,
think it is urban.
wealthy versus poorer. I think is still there as well. Urban, rural is definitely the biggest divide now. But I think that
But you need money. Yeah, that even tracks on that because you need money to live in it. It's expensive living in the city.
But you not think the north-south divide just merged into urban-rural because it's like, at that point there were just way more cities in the north and in the south, and now that's not quite the same geographically. You know what I mean? It's like it's kind of morphed into, but it's kind of morphed
Yeah,
into
but
that.
it's true actually within any individual state. I mean, I lived in Atlanta,
Yeah, yeah,
Georgia, the state
yeah,
of Georgia, and it's obvious that the city of Atlanta is pretty blue.
yeah. Same with
And you
Austin,
go
Texas.
outside, yeah, the moment you're outside the city,
Yeah,
suddenly you see, Trump stickers on back of pickup
yeah.
trucks and all
Oh,
those
for
kinds of
sure.
things.
The most pro-Obama places I went
Palpable.
to in 2008 were southern cities. Because I think when you're surrounded by more rural people, like it's almost like they're little Alamos, like the bastions of Democratic Alamo cities in the South against the rural areas. But if you're in rural California, it's super Trump. You know what I mean? It's the same, isn't it? It's just rural.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
and
Yeah,
I think it's because the life in urban America and the life in rural America is just completely different. So they're both
yeah,
kind of have valid points in their own environments. They want the country to be like them, and it just isn't. You know what I mean? It's that you can't make rural areas be like urban and urban. They don't have the same ideas.
yeah,
Needing a
yeah,
gun when you're 100 miles away from the nearest police and threatened by bears on your property and out in the middle of nowhere is very different than needing one in a city. You know what I mean? You don't need the same kind of, the same kind of threats, the same kind of environments, where when you're in the backcountry rural areas, you don't really need government intervention. It's not the same as in the city where the whole thing functions on government spending. So, it's just very, very different problems, I think. I would say, yeah, well, I would say the divisions and the colonies is the most important challenge, but they're unaware of it. So it's latent challenges underneath the surface and something that hasn't come through yet. Because I think that it's impossible to overwrite these divisions. I still think they're there. I would also argue westward expansion is really important because westward expansion and national debt are the same problems the British face. Do you see any difference? I think they are the same problems that the British faced at the end of the 7 Years' War. I think the only new thing to the party is them realizing how divided they were among themselves. But I think the other two factors were things that the British were facing themselves.
yeah. I guess so. Although, I mean, the British hadn't. They had an existing system. They had a massive empire. They have
Yes.
the East India Company. They have interests all over the world. They have
Yeah.
massive. They have the most advanced industrial
And yet they
capacity.
still lost out. You know what I mean? And they were still faced with rebellion that they put down. That's the Americans would end up being faced by rebellions, both in the Articles of
Well, it depends
Confederation
how.
and under the Constitution.
Yeah, but it depends. It depends what Britain's got a lot of a list of priorities. You can't have
Yes.
everything.
That's why I think the Americans are successful. That, and they can argue that they have representation, so they can be taxed, so they're not in the federal government. I don't know which.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think you could really make the case for any of these. I think if you wanted to, whatever you wanted to argue, I think you could make the case it was the most important. You just
I
have to
think I
different
think
ways.
the important thing for your students, the
Mm.
students, I think, is just to make sure that you frame the question in the right way.
Yeah,
Frame the question the way that you want to answer it.
yeah,
Frame it in your terms.
yeah. You have to
And then
define what and
once you do that, then
yeah,
then you can go for each one.
yeah, yeah. Whether you want to put it down as long term, most fundamental one, short term, most one they have to deal with, most one they're aware of outside. Yep, you've got so many different angles, and that's why it's quite important for debate. I like Unit 4 because I think Unit 4 is quite meaty, and I think like unlike Unit 1 where the answer is kind of obvious to most of the questions, I think with these ones you can really go any which way you want. It's really going to depend on where you put your answers to these questions in Unit 4. Says more about you and what you value than it does about the real answer to the question. Because it's like where you're putting your values in is going to be fundamentally important for these, I think. Do you agree?
I agree. Yeah, sorry, I didn't get the upward intonation of
Oh,
your
sorry. Yeah,
voice.
that's all right. I don't have
In
it.
Australia, we do it a bit too much.
I think, but when I was teaching English, a bit randomly, but we used to, they used to talk about intonation. I was like, doesn't working class don't have intonation? It's a middle class thing. I've long argued this as an English teacher.
Apparently not, James. Apparently.
No, it definitely is. Definitely is a middle class thing. All right, let's
You
stop
know,
there.
there are parts of Australia where every sentence has an upward
Well,
intonation.
yeah, but you guys are different.
You know, every sentence has an upward intonation.
Yeah, I'm talking about like in England. Like I think intonation for question asking in England is a middle class invention, not a working class one. Anyway, we'll diverge from that. So we dealt with the first question.
Have to. Everything's about classes.
For us, yeah, for sure, yeah. Like, that's not even a question. Even in the modern time, it's all about class. All right, let's move on to the next.
James, yes, we're getting diverged.